Hello, my friends. Welcome to Word Made Digital. I'm your host, Joanna LaFleur, and you're watching the YouTube version of the podcast. Week after week, we're coming at you with conversations with creatives and communicators all about how to communicate the best news in the world, but in the digital age. Thanks so much for watching, checking out this episode. If you want to know more, you want to check out more of our free resources, go to wordmadedigital.com or browse around this YouTube channel and you're definitely going to find some content that will help you. And of course, thank you so much to our sponsors, Compassion Canada and Wycliffe College are making this podcast possible. Enjoy the interview. Doug Paul, welcome to Word Made Digital. I'm really glad to have you on this podcast today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's good to be on. Particularly like looking through all the different guests that you have. Sometimes I'm like, well, how did I get onto this podcast? But really excited to be on.
Hey, well, you're on this podcast because I got your book. And I'm intrigued by it. And I know Daniel Yang. Actually, he used to be here in Toronto where I am. And Alan Hirsch, love Alan.
Yep.
And Danielle Strickland is a woman that I work with. And you, through Alan Hirsch, the Hirsches are connected. And she's, given not a forward, what do you call it? A recommendation on the book.
Yeah.
Endorsement, there's the word. So our paths were meant to collide because...
I didn't know that you knew Daniel. He is one of my favorite people.
Well, tell me, let's start there. Why don't we this doesn't have to be a linear conversation. How do you know Daniel Yang? Tell us about your connection there. He's a brilliant guy.
He is. I mean, so I've known of him from afar for a while. And then we were both speaking at the same conference last year. And he was giving his keynote, and I was just, sometimes you're like, I'm not going to be fully engaged. Like maybe there's work on my laptop that I'm going to do during the thing. And he was so good. Like not just that, his presentation style was so good. It was, but his content, which was thinking about where culture was going to be in 2050. So like 30 years from now, where's culture going to be? And the implications for the church. I literally was taking pictures on my phone that I still have of the slides on the giant screen that they had, because I was like, this is so good. And so we got to talk a little bit there. And then there are a couple of organizations that we were both working with that allowed us to do some collaborative work together. And then there were some coaching groups that we launched during COVID together. And I tell you, Daniel he's one of the most unique people I've ever been around, because he is one of the smartest, like just whip smart, insightful, and at the exact same time gentle and humble. I've just not. It's such a rare combination. It feels like the Lord has just given him a real grace in that area, and there's a reason that he's able to create such amazing collaborative spaces. I don't know.
That's true.
Like in a snapshot,
that's true.
Well, Daniel to me.
Well, and I think that starts to introduce us to you as well, which is kind of interesting. Through you talking about someone else and why you're connected to them helps us to understand who you are. So would you call yourself a futurist? Like you're listening to Daniel and like vibing off of him talking about the church in 30 years time. I mean, there are people who are by profession futurists. Yeah. Is that a direction you're in as well? Tell us a little bit about this part of you.
I would say I'm an amateur futurist. There are people who, this is a level of expertise you can have. I don't have that. My wife is a cultural anthropologist by trade. Oh. And so some of this is just our everyday dinner conversation, which our kids just love to be part of. Not
all the nerd stuff.
No. And so some of our, just the things that we talk about, the things that we enjoy are sometimes future facing and future oriented. And so when in 2019, we got into just this organic conversation around what might the church look like in 10 years. And so we actually started just she and I together, and we brought in a couple of other anthropologists. We wanted hey, let's make 10 predictions of what church could be like in 10 years, or trend lines that we're going to see that are going to happen. And it was more just for fun. And so we put out an ebook that was, it was one of those like free ebooks that you could download that was just meant to be fun. But it actually, at least for last year, got me into the idea of forecasting. There's this great little book called Super Forecasting that is really dense that I got into and just nerded out to for a while. But I don't know that that's really what I'm going to end up spending most of my time doing. I think it's important for leaders to think about the future, but it's probably not what I'm going to do professionally forever.
Right. And, when you think of the church, this whole conversation we're entering into today is about innovation. The world has changed. I want to get into the story of what happened to you at the beginning of COVID, or the COVID shutdown, I should say. And I want to get into all of that. But do you think that the church is future looking? Would you say that we're, and maybe that's hard to know, but like, are we typically like we're backwards looking? Are we forward looking? Are we looking at today? What would you say about the church in general?
I think it depends on where you're at. I think sometimes we talk about North America as if it's a monolith, like the Western church, the North American church, the American church. There's no, like, in the same way that there isn't like, there's no monolith church in this giant continent. What you're experiencing in Toronto is really different from what I'm experiencing in Richmond, Virginia, which is really different than what's happening in San Francisco, which is really different from Florida. And I think it really depends on where you're at. I think if you're
and the church may be on one corner compared to the church across the street.
Absolutely. And I think it's more about are we comfortable with the models or the vehicles that we have for church? And are we willing to just sit in that status quo? Or are we thinking regularly about like the accessibility of the gospel? Does everyone have access to the gospel with the way that we are being the church, the way that we are being sent? And if the answer is no, in whatever place or space you're in, that's where the faithfulness question, I think, starts to get introduced. Are we being faithful to innovate, not for the sake of innovation, but for the sake of the gospel?
Right. Well, that's interesting, the question of access as a measuring stick, because, I mean, on some level, like, I think of things like Wycliffe Bible translators, and other organizations, missions organizations. Their goal is to bring the gospel to the whole world. And they have, some of them have these beautiful and ambitious targets of, by this date, we want to make sure every people group has a Bible in their own language and all these kinds of things. But what do you mean by access? Because in America, in Canada, in the West, I mean, everybody, I suppose, has access on their phone or at their local library. I suppose if you were the, 0.1% that don't have a phone. But so what do you mean by that, by access to the gospel?
I think I would say, like, how easy is it for someone who is not a Christian to avoid the gospel? I think it's access versus avoidability. So think about it this way, like, because this is just, if you grew up in the church, this is just not how you think about it. If, like, Alan Hirsch and Dave Ferguson, they talked about, I think in their book in 2014, about how 60% of our current models for doing church won't work for 60% of people. Excuse me, I butchered that quote. It is that if we think about everyone, with the models that we are currently using, they would only reach up to 40% of our of people in the United States. Meaning, like, they're never ever going to use a model that we have, which means we keep doing the same kinds of stuff and not reaching a growing population, 60, 70. It's growing every year for people who don't have the gospel. And so are we saying, look, we're going to keep doing our Sunday-centric thing, and if you don't want to come to our doors, or if you don't want to check out what's happening online, it sucks for you, doesn't it? And
that's all we got.
What we kind of are saying. So that's an accessibility problem. Whereas if we are going to be innovative in how we're going to send people or send programs or send new vehicles to give people access to the gospel where they can't avoid it. And I mean that in a positive way. I don't mean that in an obtrusive way. I think that's what I'm getting at. Like if,
Shove it down.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it's just saying like, when was the last time you were invited to go to a Buddhist temple? Like I've never
Right.
considered going to a Buddhist temple if for no other reason than I've never been invited. And most people, and if I was invited, would I consider going? And so we have to put that same kind of thinking on where most people just are not going to be interested in coming to a church even if they were invited. And let's just be
Yeah.
honest, most people aren't inviting people anyway.
Or you come out of a politeness or a curiosity one time, but it's coming as a tourist as opposed to a spiritually curious person.
Yes.
I think if I were to go, I've been to mosques and temples and whatever, whether in my own country or other countries, but typically you go as sort of with a posture of curiosity or learning, but not because you're interested in embracing their belief system. It's more like an educational field trip or something.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think there are ways in which that can be okay. I mean, you kind of see that happening with Paul in Athens, where people are hanging
Right.
around the edges and are like, "What now about resurrection? What's this thing?" like, and so there was this curiosity, and I think that's okay. But I think the bigger issue around accessibility, even if from a curiosity standpoint, is at least here in the States. I can't speak for Toronto. Um, I mean, most people that are my age or younger, they find Christians really threatening and hostile, and they're not positive. And I think that's a real barrier that we're going to have to come. We got to have the come to Jesus moment about.
Well, it's is it Tim Keller? I mean, he's not the only one who talks about this, but this idea of like being the first culture in history that has tried out Christianity and now rejected it. We're on the other side of that. So the post-Christian culture,
Yeah.
not a pre-Christian where they're being introduced to it, but post-Christian where we tried that and we now say no to it. Whatever we saw of it, we tasted and saw that this was not good. We do not want this in our life. And that's where, when I'm thinking about the futurist stuff, when I'm thinking about innovation, I mean, I think that's the big question that I sit with is how do we introduce people to a faith that they have already decided that they have rejected? But I think they have not actually been introduced to what it really
Exactly.
is.
And this is like what you're hitting on is something that is deeply personal for me. So I grew up in the church. I went to Wheaton College, and I became an atheist at Wheaton. And so I was away from the
Wow.
Lord for a number of years before coming back to faith. And when I came back,
Now, can you say a little? Why did you become an
I
atheist?
mean, it was
Was
a
it
bunch of
something you
stuff.
learned
I mean,
about
it
there? Or?
was. I had developed some really bad sin patterns, struggling with depression. I mean, like some of it was like I was just really bad at relationships, and so I was just burning my life to the ground, spending money. Like I just had all of these like appetite issues that were just consuming me. I mean, whether we were talking about drinking or drugs or porn or women, I mean, like if there was something to consume, I was doing my best to consume it, and burning my life down to the ground at the same time, struggling with depression. Needless to say, I really needed to be rescued. But my understanding of what Christianity was didn't answer my questions. Like what I grew up with wasn't good news for me. And it wasn't until I really came to understand the invitation to being a disciple of Jesus in the here and now. Like a book like The Divine Conspiracy was a really big book for me. Where it's like, oh yeah, like oh this is, I literally have never heard this before. Like I've grown up in the church, I have not heard like this is good news. This is the good news I've been waiting for. And I looked at my friends, and they were either not Christians for the most part, or they had grown up in the church and left. And I'm like, they don't know what I know now. How do we give them access to this good news? And I feel like the last 20 years, that's what my life has been about. Is how do we keep innovating on like that access point where everyone can understand the fundamentally good news of the gospel?
Yeah, well, on this podcast, I say over and over most episodes at some point, this is the passion for me is, I think that the church doesn't just have good news. We have the best news in
Yeah.
the world. And so we should be the best communicators in the world. But often, of course, we're not the best communicators in the world. We fail over and over. And not just like, oh, we're fragile, sinful people. It's like we don't have a skill set
Yes.
or a discipleship that has led us to be able to communicate this appropriately or effectively or in a way that is even true. So we make good news sound like bad news. And yeah, like when you think about the kind of Christianity that a lot of people are exposed to culturally, yeah, I wouldn't want anything to do with that either. But that's not the thing that I am going after.
Yeah.
So how do I translate that to you?
Yeah, because
My friend who I love.
The question that you're bringing up is one that involves tension, because there's this one aspect that's like, does it work? Like that's we don't control that. Like we don't save people, how people respond to the gospel. We actually don't control that. The Holy Spirit calls people to God. Like that's the role of the Holy Spirit. We have no control over that. At the same time, so that one piece is faithfulness, but the other piece is, could I do a better job at what we just did? And I think we have to hold both of those in tension. Like I don't, how quote well I did at that, whether that like whatever form of communication I have or a process that I'm running or whatever it is, there are pieces of it I control. It's largely guided by the Holy Spirit, but I think we have to have both of those conversations at the same time and not go from ditch to ditch. And I think that's what so often happens, is that we throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. Well, and as you say about your own experience, like like you fundamentally didn't know the gospel that you would say you know today. And so you threw the whole thing. You threw Jesus away with this the trappings of church culture that you came from. And I think that's true of many people. When I think of how many of my peers, and even a journey in my own life, I suppose too, but how many of my peers who left church, the thing they left, I would want to leave that too. Yeah, I agree.
I mean, like, I look at some of my friends' stories and I'm like, yeah, can't blame you. Been there, done that. I mean, I get it. I really do.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, that's, when I think of the ways that Jesus interacts in the Gospels with people who are on the other side of that, like, I feel like he kind of has that posture towards some people who are the outsiders, the non-religious, the irreligious, the rejected from religion for whatever reason. I feel like the compassion he has for those people when he interacts with a Samaritan woman or someone caught in a sin behavior or someone who's been, not permitted to participate in religious activity for some reason or another, lepers, I don't blame you for having questions and wondering if God is good, because this is the situation that you come out of. So how do we do this differently? Like what? This is a huge question, which is why I wanted to talk to you. I mean, we're kind of circling the airport here, but one of the reason I have you here is because of a book called Ready or Not: Kingdom Innovation for a Brave New World, a book that's just come out. That you have authored. But this comes out of an experience that you've had this year in 2020. Can you tell us, can we go back to March?
Sure. So, I mean, like everyone else, the person, we lead a team called Catapult, Todd Milby and I, and like everyone else, we had plans for this year, and there were things that we wanted to accomplish, and we had things on whiteboards and all the stuff, right? And then COVID hits, and I am not someone who wakes up in the middle of the night. I am a deep sleeper. I need a good 7 hours, or I get real grumpy real fast. And I woke up in the middle of the night very early on. I think it was like March the 13th, because it was Friday the 13th. I mean, this is the only reason that I remember this. And I felt like the Lord was asking me to get up to pray. So like I went downstairs and spent a couple of hours just praying. And then it happened 2 more nights. And again, this has never happened. Like that experience has never happened to me. And that's not to like self-aggrandize. It's simply like it's rare for me to have had that experience. And by rare, I mean it's not happened. And at the end of the third one, I just sensed this idea coming to my mind that felt very connected in a spiritual sense to like the prayer sessions that I had had. And sort of the insight coming out of that was all of these people that we are in relationship with, who are leaders, are about to be inundated with a sea of content and about how, like, what they should do with COVID, and that their inboxes are going to quadruple in size, if not go 100 times in size, about do this, do this, do this, do this. But actually, while content is important, it's limited in what it can do. And so I just sent out a text to a group of people, Daniel Yang being one of them, was like, hey, I've got an idea that I want to run by you guys. And what we ultimately decided was we were going to start some coaching groups that were going to help pastors navigate just this crazy, we're so used to this, we're sick of hearing this word unprecedented, but this has never happened to anyone leading before. And no one knows what to do. And it doesn't matter how good of a leader you are, you're going to be shaken. What if we could navigate this time together? And
right. And yeah, how do you coach someone in something you haven't, what does that look like? I mean, just genuinely, like, that's the skeptic in me. Like, when I hear everybody's got a solution for what to do about, the pandemic. Not everybody. There are people, these talking heads, who have solutions about what to do.
Yeah.
But none of us have been here before.
Yeah.
So what did that look like? How do you come alongside and coach people when you're navigating it at the same time?
We put together a very simple framework that we felt would help leaders think through the natural, like, growth pattern and difficulty that they were going to face as leaders, as well as in their churches. And so we talked about the 4 stages, where the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to help you stabilize. We're going to help you renormalize. Then we're going to help you mobilize. And then finally, and this is we're still in this 4th phase, we want to help you think about futurize. And so we came up with a very simple framework and assigned weeks in a way that a template would work in a week that would just bring a sense of calm and help people process in smaller groups and do live troubleshooting about what they were experiencing. So, we would be doing these coaching groups, and in the same small group of people would be someone who was in rural Pennsylvania, who was in a church of like 80, and they did not have, they had rural internet. They were like on dial-up, and they couldn't just throw stuff up on Zoom. And so they were like, how do we do services on conference calls? Do we use like freeconferencecall.com? Like, so we're live troubleshooting that at the same time with like a mega church that has a $50 million budget. And we didn't always have them in the same room, but it was like, we had much more in common than you actually realized in walking through those 4 phases. And I think it was creating space for people to say out loud things that they were struggling with, and to crowdsource best practices. And this is the answer to your question. We weren't coming saying we have the answer. We were coming and saying we're just trying to create a space where we can go on this collective journey together, and we will pool best practices. And we will learn from each other, because I too am helping to lead a local church in the city center where I live. And we're struggling with the exact same things. None of us have ever led through a pandemic before. And so I think there's got to be this sense of we're all in this together. Let's go on this journey together. And ultimately it caught. Like, a lot of people ended up coming into one of these coaching groups, and it was just a really, really astonishing time for the church, and for at least me being on the front edges of some of those coaching groups.
Yeah, and when you say astonishing, like, do you have, this book that came out of this type of innovation that you were trying to do in the group, is my understanding, that the group was the pilot, the case study, the experiment of what is possible.
Well, I think So the book was 95% done when COVID hit. And what we did is we fast tracked it. But what the groups represented was it is possible to take the principles that we're talking about with innovation. And here's like an example. Here's one example of what it could look like if you applied it. And so how do you innovate something and then scale it quickly? And so
Right.
that's ultimately what it did, is that it went from, just 50 churches to more than 10,000 churches in 5 weeks. And so it's like, how do we take a spark of an innovation, pilot it, test it, get it going, multiply it, scale it? And I think that the original question that you were talking about with why this book and why now is I just believe that innovation's a skill set like any other. Preaching is a skill set. Team management is a skill set. You can be good at it. You can suck at it. And this is something that we can actually learn how to do. And it is a muscle worth growing.
So that's interesting because that's innovation or being, I mean, I would use maybe a word more like creative, but I think innovation and creativity are complementary words or complementary skills. So you would say that it's a skill to be learned. It's not like this is an innovator and this person is just going to follow whatever that guy does.
It's one of the great myths that exists around innovation is that some people are the innovators and the rest of you poor schmucks are not. It's just not true. And like when you actually look at some of the greatest innovations that have happened, social innovations, they have not come from pioneers. They have come because there was a desperate need. So Bill Wilson.
So can you give an example?
Yeah, Bill Wilson is one of the greatest innovators in the history of social movements. Very few people know his name or who he is. And he did not mean to start something that was going to reach 130 million people. But what he needed to do was to stop drinking. He couldn't stay sober. He was completely binging on alcohol for 14 straight years. And it wasn't until he found a friend named Bob Smith, and the two of them ultimately created Alcoholics Anonymous, that led to the innovation that we now know as Alcoholics Anonymous, and lots of people coming to faith in Jesus because of it. But it didn't start because he had a vision for 130 million people, or like, man, I want to be an innovator. It was, I've got to stop drinking. Sometimes the greatest innovations are like, we got to solve this problem.
Like it's personal. This is just this is a personal angst or pain point I need a solution for.
And I think this is so important. We have to use the laboratory of our life when it comes to kingdom innovation. We sometimes, when we think about creativity or we're thinking about communication or thinking about innovation, we go straight organizational. And we think about we're immediately going to scale, but it's got to start in your own life first. Start at your dinner table. Start with your kids or your friends or the people who are closest to you, and just throw some mud up against the wall and see if it sticks before you're like, I have an idea and I am sure it will work. Like it probably won't actually, or at least it's not going to work like you think it's going to.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and usually people, and that's maybe what I came back to what I was saying about like, how can you coach people in something that you're experiencing for the first time too? Maybe it's coming just even simply with some humility behind the idea of I'm not sure this will work, but we're going to try a new thing and risk looking silly or risk failing or risk, I don't know. Yeah. We tried it for a couple weeks, couple months, couple years. Now we're gonna cut ties with it and move on to something else. And
I exactly, and I think that's one thing is what you say, like you can cut ties and be like, well, that was kind of embarrassing. But the worst thing, and what most leaders do, is they don't. They just keep running it because they feel it's called the sunken cost fallacy. It's like, well, I'm pot committed now. I have to keep putting money into this thing, resources into this thing, because I don't want to admit that it's not working. Because whatever, we are allergic to failure. We are allergic to looking like we made a misstep or a miscue.
You know, that was like when I had a Mini Cooper that was getting old. And those little cars are so fun, but cost a lot to repair. And it's a classic thing of like, how much more money are you going to put into something to keep it going versus just like get rid of that thing and
That's
go try something
I
new.
so I had a Mini Cooper, and
Did you?
I did, and in 2015, it was about to have, I mean, maybe 16, a load of repairs. I mean, more repairs than the car was worth. And I really liked this car.
Yeah.
And eventually, like my wife talked me off the ledge and was like, we got to get rid of this car. Like we cannot
Yeah.
put more repairs into the car than it's worth.
Well, as a fellow Mini lover,
Yeah.
maybe, I mean, that's, I use the Mini not just because there's a regular car, but there's actually like like a club.
There is a club.
There's a tribe that you're part of. There's a feeling associated. This isn't just driving, I don't know, a Toyota Corolla because it's functional. There's something about the Mini that is a feeling
It makes
that
me
you're
feel
or
a
a
certain
life
way about myself.
you're trying to
Yeah.
have. Yeah, and so getting rid of it is part of like it's maybe even some weird identity connection thing where you don't want to get rid of it. And I mean, I think that's a perfect analogy really for church problems is that like there comes a point where like we've tried this, it is a part of our identity, it's
Yeah.
part of our brand or whatever, and we're part of the tribe that all has that thing, but we're gonna be the first to say like we can't put any more into this, we have to leave the
Yeah.
club.
Well, I was talking to Andy Crouch about this. And I mean, he wrote, I mean, is it 10 years old now? Culture Making, just a really great book on how to make culture
Yeah.
and having creativity in culture. And he was saying, I thought he had this really fascinating insight where he said one of the reasons that so many churches don't change is because there's so much unprocessed grief that is latent in the members of the church. And what they do with unprocessed grief is they take that emotional and spiritual angst and they attach it to things. So they'll attach it to the sanctuary that was like it was before that person died, or this program that we used to run that my son was in before he ran away, or this thing before I got a divorce. And because the
Yeah.
grief isn't ever fully like healed from, and we aren't great at pastoring and shepherding that, people attach it to things that are tactile. And that's actually one of the fundamental reasons that we can't change things. 'Cause sometimes leaders will be like, well, they won't let me change things. And one of the most paradoxical things with change and adaptation is we actually have to be really good at shepherding. And sometimes we think we only have to be good at
Interesting.
pioneering, but we actually have to be equally as good at shepherding, or people aren't going to go with us. We'll just be a man or woman on a walk. We're not going to be leaders.
Right.
No one's following.
Right. Well, okay, when you're talking about this, the thing that comes to mind from your content, and again, when I discovered your book, even just your website, I was like, I want to talk to this guy, is there's a video on your website about Sunday school.
Yeah.
And that to me is exactly the illustration of what we're talking about. Can you tell us a little bit about the story of where Sunday school started? And obviously, I think even if we're not Christians, we all kind of have a sense of where it's evolved to today.
Yeah, I think most people know what it is today, and they probably assume that it's been like that for 150 years. But really, there have been two iterations of Sunday school, and they are very different from each other. The way that Sunday school started was you had a man named Robert Rakes who started this class that would go from 8 a.m. to 5:30 on Sundays for kids in the 1770s who were working 80, 90, 100 hours a week at age 7. And the only day that they had off was Sunday. And so
These are like factory kids, Industrial Revolution.
Think Industrial Revolution, think London, think about the rural towns that turn into factory towns outside in England.
Yeah.
And they are, and then as of now, like education can be, not always is, but can be a thing to get someone out of poverty. And so they were like, we're going to teach kids how to read. We're going to teach them how to write. We're going to teach them the basics of mathematics. And there'll be lunch, there will be breakfast, there will be dinner. I mean, like it was a full day dedicated to helping kids get out of poverty, while at the same time, I think he had this ingenious thing where the way that he taught them to read was by using the Bible. And so he was able to marry
Right.
two things together, justice and evangelism, which we think are sometimes like on polar opposites, but actually he was able to bring those things together. And 50 years later,
Wow.
2 million kids are in Sunday school. And
Like quite literally Sunday school. They're
literally
at school
Sunday
on Sundays
school.
in a time where only the elite would have education.
Exactly. And ultimately culture
So
changed.
they were
that.
illiterate. Yeah.
It changed because
Yeah.
they passed all these laws, which was good. It was like, hey, we're gonna you can't work that much. You can't if you're 7, maybe this isn't good for you. We're gonna start public schools. That was a good thing. But poverty was still a problem, and spiritual poverty was still a problem. And rather than Sunday school going back to the original why did we start this? What was the mission? What was the vision? It pivoted in the opposite direction. And it became education for already believers, both for kids and for adults. And that's the second iteration. And it lost the revolutionary roots that it had. And I think the church is making those decisions like that every single day. And I think we got to make some different decisions.
Yeah, what started as controversial, revolutionary. I mean, even in, what you're talking about on your website, the idea that Sunday was was the one day they had to be with their family or be at home, and or like the Sabbath day was not a day to work, and this guy was doing something on the Sabbath.
It was considered an incredibly scandalous ministry at the time, because it was like, hey, you were taking education out of the hands of parents. You're breaking the Sabbath by working on the Sabbath. And it became incredibly politicized. I know this is crazy. No one would ever politicize anything. But, political pundits in the 1780s weaponized Sunday school. And were like, this is bad. Or other people being like, this is good. And they came at each other in the 1780s. Like, it's this, like, history just repeats itself.
Yeah. So, I mean, what do we need today? I mean, I guess I could go at this from two sides. Either one, do you have examples of some innovation that you're really excited about right now? Or on the other side, maybe you don't see the innovation, but you see some things that might be opportunities for someone to figure something out.
Yeah.
Do you have some ideas for us?
Yeah, I have. I mean, I think so. I mentioned earlier that project that my wife and I worked on, where we were coming up with we called it 10 church predictions for the next 10 years. And I actually think there's a really important moment coming in the future that is going to marry discipleship and evangelism together again. And I think it's going to be it's going to be similar to AA, and that there is an addiction problem, and churches and Christian leaders need to step into it and provide hope, health, and healing. And it's around technology addiction. So 79% of at least Americans, I know out in Toronto, it's probably not that much different, would self-diagnose as addicted to technology. The average person will scroll on their phone 5.4 hours a day. That's absurd.
Say it again. What's the number?
5.4? The average person will scroll on their screen 5.4 hours a day.
Right. And I don't know when that data came out, but every year the number goes higher.
It goes higher. We've had a smartphone for 12 years. It's only existed for 12 years. We are on the infantile side of what this thing is going to become. And people are becoming more dislocated from themselves, from God, from community. They're becoming more lonely, more isolated, more depressed, more anxious. Gen Z, millennials, the average millennial, 35% of them have a diagnosed anxiety disorder. Gen Z is going to be worse. And there is an opportunity for someone to stand up and be like, hey, you know how Bill Wilson started AA to help you break his alcohol addiction? We need to think about that in the same way that Alpha was thinking about that with the biggest questions that people were asking.
Yeah, now millions of people around the world have done Alpha.
30 million people have been to Alpha because this thing that already existed in 1979 as a class to help believers. When Nicky Gumbel looked at it as someone who didn't grow up in the church, he didn't see a doctrine class. He saw an evangelism opportunity. And this is a giant opportunity for us, I think, around technology addiction.
And do you see anyone doing anything like I think of like a John Mark Comer as sort of a pastor of this kind of voice in the world right now, who's sort of trending, with the ruthless elimination of hurry, like trying to get away from technology. Even when I wrote my master's thesis around digital discipleship and evangelism, would have been 4 or 5 years ago. What I would say today is different than what I would have said then, because the problem has become so much greater, and my caution to work for others and for myself would be much higher. My pastoral caution around engagement with tech. So are you seeing anyone do it? Or maybe you're saying this is an opportunity, or do you have any pointers? Like if people are like excited about this idea, do you have anything you can point us towards?
I think we're on the front edges of this. Again, just what you said, like what you would say now versus even 5 years ago is different. If for no other reason than it takes 10 years for substantive research of how technology shapes us to come back. So we were only getting the first good research on this in 2018, because that smartphones came out in 2008. And so I think we're on the front edges of people thinking through this problem. I like what John Mark Comer is saying in terms of ethos. I don't like, this isn't a criticism. I don't think this is his space. I don't think it's as practical as is necessary. Like when you think about AA, you're thinking like, hey, 12 steps, sponsors, group, like there are some real practical handles to it. There's a book coming out next month that Andy Crouch and his wife. Is it Julie? Julie Crouch? I really should know her name. I've met her.
The Crouches.
The Crouches, thank you. Called The Tech Wise Family, which is a follow-up from the Tech Wise book that he wrote a couple years ago. And I've seen some of it, and I think it's going to be very, very helpful. But I think similar to some of the things I talk about in the book, content is limited. It can only do so much because you need to do this with people. That's the genius of Alpha. That's the genius of AA. If we are stuck or addicted, a piece of breakthrough involves other people in the journey that we're on with them.
Well, I love this. I'm getting fired up over here, and like my brain is literally like spinning around how I want to be part of solving some of these problems. I know it because I do know it in myself. I got a screen on my wrist that buzzes all the time with all kinds of crap, and also lets me know when I haven't moved enough today, which I suppose is good because of the digital stuff I'm doing. But okay, there's an idea that I'm meandering to here. You talk about innovation bias, and this quote I want to read from your book. The question is where our bias is. So we all have bias.
Sure.
But where is our bias? Does our bias lead us towards innovations that are heavyweight, high maintenance, led by elite leaders, and hard to multiply? I.e., are we innovating in a way like AA that can be brought to the masses, or is it something that's kind of inaccessible to most people? What are we building, or what is our bias towards in the group we're building for?
I think in writing that, the purpose of stating it is to say, it's not bad. Like heavyweight, high maintenance, takes skill, high level of leadership expertise in order to do it. That's not bad. There are lots of examples. Like let's stick with the alcoholism one, for example. There are rehab centers and there's AA. Both are necessary. We need both of those. Again, this can be about accessibility. And we want everyone to have access to, if they are addicted to alcohol, we want them to have access to something that will help them break it. But if all that you have is a rehab center and the cost of entry is $30,000 a month, we have an access problem. And so it's actually having both of those.
And so, that will help some people, but how do we help other people?
And I think we live in a space right now where our bias is towards elite leadership, heavyweight things, expensive things, that has a real ceiling on how many people can be reached. I really think that. And if our calling is to see every single person have multiple times, multiple opportunities to hear and respond to the gospel of Jesus, to be a disciple of Jesus, we're going to need what I call a mixed economy. We're going to need multiple things happening at the same time. And I think we're used to wanting there to be a silver bullet that will solve everything. If we all look like North Point, if we all look like Life Church, if we all did Tampa Underground or whatever it would be, these are great things that happen. But what is God calling you to? Like, what does it look like for God to incarnate yourself, word made, like where you are at, you know?
Well, I mean, it's back to what we started our conversation with, this idea that all these churches that are doing things in a certain way, there's still, whatever the number is, 40, 60, 80% of people who won't ever go to any of those kinds of things, because it doesn't matter if it's the charismatic church or the Hillsong church or the Presbyterian church or the, whatever, all these different kinds of expressions of worship, none of them are going to connect with that person. And so, yes, we need like an ecosystem that has lots of innovative, diverse approaches to reach all kinds of people.
All kinds of people. Every person. Every single person.
Yeah.
Like that's what the Great Commission is. It's the completion of every single people group has had access to the gospel.
And when you think of sort of the global church, the non-American or the non-North, I'm North American.
Yeah.
What do you see happening? What's something that you're excited about when we're reaching other kinds of people?
I tell you, I am a chief evangelist for this right now. We are working. So I help lead an organization called Catapult, and we work with like churches, nonprofits, denominations, networks, blah, blah, blah. One of the organizations we're working with, I would highly encourage, if you're listening to this, check out this website. They're called New Generations, newgenerations.org. And they are doing this thing called DMM, which some people might know about, disciple making movements. It's a very specific brand of how to do this. And they are targeting unreached people groups that have had no access to the gospel for at least 200 years or more. And some people never, ever, ever, their culture, tribe, whatever, has never heard the gospel before. And one of the things that is ridiculous is they are the gold standard for tracking. They're doing qualitative, quantitative, and sustainability tracking for these generational movements. It is unbelievable what God is doing. In 15 years, there are almost 2 million people who have come to faith in Jesus with so little overhead in terms of money, in places. I can't name all the places that they're in for safety of like different people who are in those places.
Sure.
That are.
But we're not talking about maybe like less in the West. We're talking about sort of the 2/3 world.
We're talking we're talking developing, but we're also talking, we can be talking about Eastern Europe as well.
Yeah.
Like one nut that they're trying to crack right now is Western urban cities outside the United States. And that is a very difficult nut to crack. There's one, they're in Johannesburg right now, and they're just starting to see some stuff happen there that I think is incredibly exciting. But one of the things that I love is like they're learning all these principles around disciple making and how it can multiply and doesn't require money to do that. Well, I've got these friends who are trying to take those same principles and apply it, and they're in Kansas City. And they're thinking through what that looks like here in a Western context. They're guys, Rob Wegner and Brian Phipps. And I'm just so I'm just so excited that there are people who are trying things that look nothing like what we've seen before and are actually like putting that into practice. And they're like dogged with it. They're like dogs with a bone who refuse to give up on this idea that disciples can make disciples who make disciples. So newgenerations.org,
like
definitely.
The Great Commission. Refusing to give up on the initial idea that we've maybe lost along the way.
And it's not like there's is it Jeff Bezos who says like have strong opinions held loosely. I think it might have been him. I think that's a big thing with this, where we think about with innovation these things that we're trying, and we see this a lot with some of the different organizations that Catapult works with, where let's have really strong opinions about the practices for what it could look like, but hold those very loosely. You could be wrong. I mean, it might not work. Let's be committed to the principles. Let's not hold those loosely, but the practices, let's be real, we could be wrong. And I think oftentimes we are, and that's okay.
The methods versus the message, exactly. I guess is what other people say. Yeah. There's so much in your book around how to start innovating, building, as if anyone can be an innovator, and we need innovators during this moment in history. The good news is it's not an elite group. Anyone can do it. Your book outlines the steps of how to start doing that. You have all kinds of inspiration and examples from like current and historic events of how people have done innovation. But is there, we first of all, we want to get like what are the things you want to point people at? You've already mentioned a few websites, but where do you want people to find you? And then we'll just like anything you want to close with. What do you want to encourage the church with, the creatives and communicators who are listening today?
Yeah, I mean, from where can you find things? The two websites to point people to. There's my personal one, dougpaul.org. I did .org because .com was not available. I am not an org. I know. But the other one, and probably I think the much more important one, is wearecatapult.org. That's
okay.
The team that we're part of, and a lot of the work that we're doing and the innovation that we're seeing, you'll find there. The encouragement that I would really give people, or maybe the coaching, I'm not sure, one or the other, maybe both, is don't look for a tactic to be the next silver bullet that's going to solve all the problems. It never works. What I want to encourage people to, and why I felt like the book was meant to be hope-filled, encouraging, and it would really fire people up towards this central idea, is that innovation is a skill you can learn, and it's a muscle you can grow. And if you will actually discipline yourself to grow that muscle, it will pay dividends for the next 40 years of your leadership life, or however long that you happen to be on this earth. And that sounds really morbid, the way that I just phrased that.
No, it's good.
But however long you're in leadership, however long that you are here, that God has placed you here, if you will grow that muscle, you can go through dozens of tactics. But if you only go for tactics, you're going to be committing yourself to something that is going to be it's just going to be irrelevant in a couple of years. Grow the muscle, right. Don't search for the tactic.
I love it. Doug, Paul, I'm so glad to have met you, to think innovation and, the kingdom that is expanding all around us. And we have so much to learn, and we have so much to do. So I hope that people grab a copy of your work and ultimately get into your mind to learn from you, because there is much to be done. And I hope people start getting that earworm about how to handle digital addiction. Is a really great place to start. Let's go solve that problem, everybody. Word Made Digital Tribe. Let's go solve it. Let's go do something about it.
That's great.